Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and have a chance to chat with you and share some thoughts and some observations about Sri Lanka. I thought what I might do, particularly for some people who might be new to this discussion, to put into a bit of a context my own personal involvement with Sri Lanka, and say that from the end of the time of the temporary truce in the Civil War in 2000 until 2006, I paid several visits to Sri Lanka, to all parts of the country, north and south, and as well as in the Vani. Had several meetings with the leaders of the government of Sri Lanka, as well as, under the rubric of the peace discussions, had many discussions with the leadership of the Tamil Tigers. I saw firsthand, for example, the extent of the damage in Jaffna and around Jaffna. All of the communities south of Jaffna, as you take the Jaffna Road down to the Vani, you could not help but see many communities which had been completely bombed out, hospitals bombed out, whole schools bombed out, just everything strafed and bombed. In fact, just one anecdotal story, I was meeting with the advisors to the president in about 2003 or 4, and one of the most senior officials in the government of Sri Lanka, a public servant, said to me, he said, I don't believe the damage has been that bad. And so I said, well, have you actually been there? And he said, no, I've not been back yet. He said, but I will go. And so on my next trip, I met the same individual, and he looked at me and he said, Mr. Rae, I have to apologize to you, because when I spoke to you, I was not aware of just how much damage the Civil War had done to the north, and how devastating the physical damage was that led to the decision on the part of, let us not forget, many hundreds of thousands of Tamils to come to other countries, to come to Canada in some cases, but to leave Sri Lanka. I'm not going to recount, because I don't necessarily have all the time. I would encourage anyone who wants to read it to read the chapter in the book that I wrote called Exporting Democracy, where I discuss the situation in Sri Lanka. But I will just say this, that as the struggle resumed, as the Civil War it was clear that there was enough breaches of the ceasefire and enough elements of conflict going all the way through, that it became clear to the people that I was working with at the Forum of Federations, and we had many discussions with the ceasefire monitors, that the conflict was likely to resume. And I had a discussion with the then political leader of the Tamil Tigers, Mr. Kamal Chelvan. I talked to him directly about the prospects of a renewed conflict. And of course, as with all of my conversations with the leadership, they were always marked by a combination of personal courtesy and a reluctance to talk directly, I would say, would be the way I would put it. That the kind of conversation that we would assume would take place in Canadian politics was difficult to have. And I grew quite frustrated with this because it went on for about an hour, and we were talking and going back and forth and talking past each other. And at one point in the conversation at the end, I said, you know, Mr. Kamal Chelvan, I have to tell you that my estimate of what will happen is that if there is a resumption of full conflict, if there's a resumption of full armed conflict between the two sides, the Sri Lankan government will not stop. they will have the tacit, complicit acceptance of many other countries that they, quote, have no choice. No government will come to your support, and you will be isolated, and I fear for the future of the community. And I don't like to say that I was right, but 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, Mr. Tamil Chelvan was killed because he was on his cell phone, and they tracked down where his cell phone was. He was assassinated, essentially, in a targeted assassination. And we all know what happened subsequently. My life then changed. I became a member of Parliament, and I was in Parliament at the last moments of the conflict. And because of the contacts that I had, and because of the people that I knew, and the people that I'd met in my role as advisor to the peace process, I continued to hear stories, and I shared them with others who I knew would also be aware of what was happening. We tried very much to get the government of the day to respond, bringing in the concept of the responsibility to protect and saying that there is a responsibility to protect the civilians, and knowing that there is going to be a devastating consequence. And as the numbers moved up through the Vani, as the occupation, the army moved up through and forced more and more people into this little corner, it's clear that there was a huge loss of life in the last several weeks of the conflict, and particularly at the end of the conflict. And I think that's undeniable. I think that even in the reports that we've seen from the Sri Lankan government itself, there's a recognition that this did happen. As well, and this always sometimes gets me into trouble, I have to say, that the ethic, the fighting ethic of the Tigers always was one that excluded the possibility of allowing people to either dissent or to get out of where they were. And I think that there's no question that that's an element of responsibility that has to be assessed on an objective basis. It's not always easy to do so, but it's there. Let me now talk about the situation today and say that two things. One is, I continue to believe that the reluctance of the Sri Lankan government to accept a full internationally recognized review of what is taking place, of what has taken place, and what is taking place today is a cause not just for concern, but a cause for serious criticism by the Canadian government. And of course, I've noticed the shift in the position of the Canadian government, as we all have over the last year or so, 6 months to a year, where the government now seems to be willing to be more publicly critical of the government of Sri Lanka, having taken for a very long time the position that if they were anti-terrorist and anti-Tiger, there was nothing to criticize. I think now they realize, and we can all debate on why they realize this, that they have changed their position somewhat. But I say somewhat because before everyone falls in love with the Conservatives, let me just remind you of the answer that Mr. Kenny gave today. Now, I know that, I know how the world works. I know that the Conservative government is working hard in the community, and I know that that's the position that they're taking. But let me just remind you of what they're doing. They're saying two things at the same time. The Prime Minister is saying, I'm not going to go to Sri Lanka if the Commonwealth Conference is held there unless there are serious changes in the treatment of people in Sri Lanka. And Mr. Kenny said today, it's perfectly safe for people to go back. That's what he said. He said that today. He said, instead of allowing people to apply to come to Canada from a refugee camp in Togo, where people now are, and there are other refugee camps around the world, instead of allowing people to apply and either be sponsored by their relatives or deal with it on a humanitarian basis, it is now the official position of the Government of Canada that it's okay to go back. And it's also the official position that, by and large, refugee claims will be denied because there is no grounds for concern with respect to people who are of Tamil origin in Sri Lanka. But this completely ignores the reality that we know is on the ground. Even today, we know there are serious human rights issues which are there. Now, you'll forgive me for a moment if I don't admit to some degree of personal skepticism with respect to the position of the government of Sri Lanka, because you have to remember one other little biographical fact, and that is that once the conflict was over, I got on a plane and flew to Sri Lanka. And when I got there, I was stopped. I had a visa. I had a visa that was granted by the High Commissioner. The High Commissioner said the government is looking forward to meeting you. The government is looking forward to explaining the situation to you. And when I got there, I was told that I was not welcome in Sri Lanka, and I was stopped at the airport. I arrived at night, at 11 o'clock at night. I was told I had to get on the next plane. I refused. I said, I'm waiting here until I have an explanation. As soon as I arrived, up on the website of the Department of Defense, it said that Mr. Rae is a well-known enemy of Sri Lanka and is a threat to the national security of the country. So that's me, right? Little old me. Like, you see who I am, what I do, what I say, what I've said. I've been, for a long time, as you'll know, within the Tamil community, people said, we're not quite sure about Bob Rae. He keeps talking about the tigers. He keeps making a point saying the tigers are not the angels of light, that there's a problem. And I'm not apologetic about my position. I see problems on all sides of this issue. But so when the government of Sri Lanka says somebody is a terrorist, or they say someone is a threat to the security of Sri Lanka, I think, well, you said that about me. So if you said it about me, how do I know that what you have to say about others is any more true than what you say about me? And so I still think we need some real vigilance and some real answers. I congratulate the group for continuing to be vigilant and to provide answers and to insist that there has to be an accounting and a reckoning for what has taken place. I think the South African model teaches us one thing, and that is before you can have reconciliation, you need to have truth. And I keep coming back to this point because people say, let's have reconciliation, everybody get along. Well, that doesn't work in any conflict resolution situation. That doesn't really work unless there's a willingness to accept fault, blame, responsibility, and a willingness to account for what has taken place. So when there is an accounting, there will be responsibility on all sides. Because no one in this conflict was angelic or in their behavior. And there will also be accounting with respect to the failure of the international community to intervene at times and at moments when international intervention was absolutely required. One last anecdotal story, which I've told in my little chapter on Sri Lanka, and it may strike you all as somewhat odd, but one of my trips to the Vani, I was sitting at a lunch table. We were chatting with a number of individuals, all of whom are now dead. And Ian Martin was there with me. He was there. He was looking at the prison situation and looking at the treatment of prisoners in the country, looking at the police and justice system on behalf of the peace process. And there was a fellow at the end of the table who started talking to me and said, you Canadians, you seem to understand a little bit about what's going on here. He said, and your name is, I said, my name is Rae. He said, Mr. Rae, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah. He says, did you by any chance go to Oxford? And I said, yes, I actually did many years ago. I was at Oxford for a couple of years. And he said, and what college did you go to? And I said, I went to Balliol College, which is one of the colleges at Oxford. And he came over and he shook my hand and he said, I'm also a Balliol man. I said, interesting. Here we are in the middle of the Vani. It's virtually the jungle. It's not very fancy. I said, well, do you mind if I ask what exactly you're doing here? He said, well, I worked for the World Bank. I was an international civil servant. And I decided that I would go back to the struggle. And I've been here for 2 years, and I'm providing advice on X, Y, and Z. And we struck up a friendship. We started chatting about different things and people that we remembered and mutual friends and so on. And I never heard from him again, except in the last week of the struggle. A letter appeared in my mailbox. It had no stamp. And it was a letter from this individual, this man. And he said, "It's the end. We're trying to surrender. We would like to be able to give up. Please use all of your influence to protect us in this situation." And we did. We raised questions in the House of Commons. But I can tell you that, and then the letter ended. I mean, it's one of those wonderful, sort of sad and terrible things. It ended with the Latin motto of our college, which is Floreat Domus, may the house flourish. And I can tell you that really just made me realize that we live in such difficult and different worlds. And I suspect there are many people, for all I know, here and elsewhere, who also heard from people who were in Navani, who also heard from people who went to the beach and who couldn't get out and tried to get out and tried to get messages out and tried to contact and tried to use their cell phones and tried to engage. There was an element of desperation in those last 2 or 3 weeks that I think we all understand and appreciate. And I must say, for me, the challenges in Sri Lanka and the people and the what's still to be done is very much on my mind. People who say the conflict is resolved are wrong, because the conflict has not been resolved. The conflict has been suppressed, and there's a difference between suppression and resolution. And people have to understand that. And that, to me, is the issue. When all of our efforts in peacemaking and in trying to get to a constitutional resolution, we're all about recognizing the distinctiveness and the need to understand the differences between people and to understand the distinctiveness of the Tamil community within Sri Lanka. That you cannot make progress by suppressing the reality of that identity, and the challenge is to find a way to include that identity in the identity of a broader country. Now, it's not for me to say what the political future will hold. It's not for me to say whether or not the transnational government will take on a life of its own. I have to tell you that my own view is that that's unlikely. And that it's most likely that the solutions will have to be found within Sri Lanka, and that's where the future will be found. But I do genuinely believe that the efforts that were made and that have been made over the history of Sri Lanka since the mid-1920s, since the first efforts by the British, or the first recognition by the British that change was coming and they had to begin to establish a more accountable and democratic government in the country, there's been a continuing dialogue, that means for about 90 years in the modern era, on the question of how people will live together. What will be the recognition of mutual rights? What will be the respect for differences? What will be the protection for language? What will be the protection for separate governance? I'll give you one last example. When I was in Jaffna, the first time I visited Jaffna, one funny story and then one not so funny point. Funny story, of course, is that, as you know, I don't know if any of you visited Jaffna during the period of the truce, but you flew to Jaffna from Sri Lanka in an old Russian plane, and you get out and then you get on a bus, and the bus would take you to a field, and then another bus should have all the bags on it, and then a guy would stand up on the bus and throw the bags at people and hope that somebody would catch them. So I'm standing there, very unceremoniously, waiting to catch my bag, and the guy who's throwing the bags says, "You're Bob Rae." I said, "Yes, that's right." I said, "How do you know who I am?" He says, "Oh, I'm from Scarborough. I'm here for the summer, just visiting my family in Jaffna." Well, that was one story, which I thought was interesting. And the second one, though, was different. And that was, you have to understand the extent to which Jaffna was, and I suspect still is, under occupation. It is under military occupation in a way that's quite bizarre. None of the soldiers who were there could speak Tamil. And so imagine, if you can, if you're a Canadian, and my friend from the bloc is here, imagine for a moment if you're living in Quebec City and you have soldiers or policemen who are there who don't speak French. Or imagine you're in Toronto and you have policemen who only speak French. I mean, we have to say that there's a kind of unwillingness to admit that there is a distinct community in Sri Lanka which speaks a different language. And we all have to come to terms with the fact that that community has as much right to its voice, and we can all argue about what governance should be and what forms it should take, and that debate can continue to go on. But the notion that it can be done without recognizing that distinctiveness is, I think, just fully and wholly mistaken. So the human rights issues in Sri Lanka continue. The constitutional debates are not over. It's still a very difficult and challenging society at the moment, and I think will continue to be for a long period of time. But I must say that the one thing that I can say about my life today is that there is a piece of Sri Lanka which is still inside me, and I suspect it will be there until the end of my life. And I hope very much that the conditions will be such one day that the government of Sri Lanka will no longer see that I'm an enemy of the country or a threat to the national security of Sri Lanka. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.